The first snow of the season fell without ceremony, without the soft wonder that children pressed against frosted window panes might feel. It came sideways, driven by a wind that had spent 3 days gathering itself over the ridgelines of the Allegheny Mountains before descending into the narrow valley below, and it arrived the same morning Clara Wren was told to leave. She was at the well when Earl Sutter came through the front door. She noticed his coat first already buttoned to the throat, the collar turned up as though he had made his decision inside the warmth of the house and needed the armor of wool before delivering it. He stood on the porch and did not come farther. His hands stayed at his sides. He did not look at her directly, choosing instead a point somewhere past her left shoulder toward the bare tree line, toward nothing in particular. "You're old enough now," he said, "old enough to find your own way." Clara set the bucket down. Water sloshed over the rim and darkened the frozen mud at her feet. She was 17 years old and had hauled water from that well every morning for 6 years, beginning at 11, when her father died in the logging camp 12 miles north, and Earl had come to collect her like a piece of unclaimed property. She had split kindling before any light touched the valley floor. She had patched the south fence 3 springs running, lone, her hands cracked and bleeding from wire and cold. She had harvested beside Earl through 2 full autumns without complaint, working rows until her back refused to straighten properly, and she had done all of it without being asked twice because the unspoken agreement between them had always been perfectly clear. Her labor was the rent she paid for existing under his roof. She understood, standing at the well with water soaking through her worn boot sole on the left foot, that the agreement had changed. Aunt Maren had died in July, 3 days after the fever took hold, and with her had gone the only warmth the farmhouse had ever contained. The rooms had changed after that in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Silences grew a different texture. Meals shrank without explanation. Earl began drinking earlier in the afternoon and sitting longer in the evenings by the stove, staring at the wall above the mantel where a framed needlework of Maren's hung slightly crooked, and no one straightened it anymore. He did not grieve loudly. He grieved the way certain men did, by contracting, by closing, by looking at everything around him and calculating what could be removed. Clara understood that she was something that could be removed. "Today," Earl said, still not meeting her eyes. "Not after the snow clears. Today." He went back inside. The door latched behind him with a sound that was not loud and did not need to be. She stood in the yard for what felt like a long time. The snow thickened. Inside the house, ordinary sounds continued. The clank of the stove lid being lifted, the scrape of a poker against iron, sounds of a life proceeding without interruption. No one appeared at the window. No one came back out. Clara had half expected something, not a reversal of his decision, but perhaps a secondary acknowledgement that what was happening was difficult, that it cost something. The silence of the house told her it cost nothing. That was the part she filed away in the place inside her chest where she kept things she did not plan to forget. She went to her room and took what there was to take. A wool coat heavier than the one she was wearing hung on the peg behind the door. She put it on over the other. 2 pairs of wool socks, which she pulled on over the pair already on her feet, because she had walked enough cold ground to know that feet were the first thing winter killed. A knitted cap that Maren had made 3 winters ago, the stitching tight, and even the only thing Clara owned that had required someone else's effort rather than her own. She folded it once before putting it on. Earl had left a canvas pack on the kitchen table. She did not thank him for it. Inside, a half loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, already hardening at the edges in the cold kitchen air. 2 jars of preserved green beans sealed with wax. A folded wool blanket, thin but dry, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of burlap, her father's hunting knife. She lifted the knife out and held it a moment before sliding it into the pack's side pocket, where she could reach it without opening the main flap. The handle was dark wood worn smooth by years of her father's grip, and then 6 years of her own occasional handling. She had taken it out sometimes in the evenings to oil the blade more out of habit than necessity. The steel bore a maker's mark near the hilt, 2 letters pressed into the metal rather than engraved SD. She had always assumed it belonged to whoever had forged it, some craftsman whose name she had never thought to trace. Her father had never mentioned where the knife came from. He had died when she was 11, and the things she had not thought to ask him formed a list that grew longer with the years. She shouldered the pack, pulled the front door closed behind her without looking back at the interior, and walked out of the farmyard and onto the road heading east toward town. The town of Keller's Crossing sat 11.5 miles away, across ground that was passable in good weather and uncertain in bad. The road ran along the valley floor for the first 6 miles, crossing Hatcher's Creek twice on plank bridges that flexed under weight, then climbed a long, shallow grade through second-growth timber before descending into the town proper. In July, the walk would take 3 hours at a reasonable pace. Clara had done it twice, both times with Earl, both times in summer. She had never done it in snow, and she had never done it alone. And as she turned east on the road and felt the wind come directly at her from that direction, as though the weather itself had aligned to meet her head-on, she began doing the kind of arithmetic that mattered in serious situations. She had 2 jars of food bread, a blanket, a knife, and the clothes layered on her body. The temperature had been dropping since 2 days before and was still dropping. Snow was already accumulating in the wagon ruts, the tracks from the last passage, probably Earl's from 3 days ago, filling in and softening. By afternoon, the ruts would be gone entirely. By evening, the road itself would be indistinguishable from the fields on either side, and walking it would require guesswork. The danger was not what most people imagine. Most people pictured sudden, dramatic freezing, collapse unconsciousness, the clean mercy of numbness. The real threat worked slower and was therefore harder to respect. Cold combined with exertion produced sweat. Sweat saturated wool and cotton from the inside, stripping away insulation faster than standing in still air ever could. Wet clothing and dropping temperatures became a mechanism for pulling heat directly from the body's core, and the body's response to that loss, shivering, which was expensive muscular effort to generate warmth, burned through calories that Clara did not have in surplus. Exhaustion followed. Poor decisions followed exhaustion. Then poor decisions compounded themselves, each one smaller than the last, until the accumulation of small failures produced a single large one. Her father had told her this on a hunting trip years before his death, in the careful way he explained things he considered important. He had crouched beside her at the edge of a clearing where a deer had bedded the previous night, and while she studied the pressed-down grass, he had said that the woods did not kill people with dramatic violence most of the time. Mostly the woods just waited for people to make enough small mistakes. She had been 9 years old. She had not fully understood what he meant until now. She removed her outer coat on the first long hill, despite the temperature, because she could feel herself beginning to work hard enough to sweat, and she folded it and strapped it across the top of the pack. The cold hit her immediately, and her instinct pushed back against the decision with something close to panic, but she held the discomfort and kept moving, and within a quarter mile her body temperature had stabilized at a level that let her produce enough heat without overproducing it. She put the coat back on when she reached the bottom of the grade, and the road flattened out and her pace slowed. By noon, she had covered perhaps 4 miles. The snow had thickened from a nuisance to an event, large dense flakes that fell without much wind. Now the earlier gusting having gone still, which would have been pleasant except that still air in this kind of snowfall meant the temperature was still dropping rather than stabilizing. The bread she pulled from the pack had gone hard enough that she broke off pieces and held them in her mouth until they softened rather than trying to chew them outright, which was a technique she had learned from her father as well. Cold bread swallowed too quickly sat in the stomach wrong and made the body work to warm it rather than using that energy for movement. Her left boot was failing. The sole had been thinning for the better part of a year, and Earl had not replaced it, and she had not asked him to, and now the cold was coming up through the leather directly into the ball of her foot with each step. She stopped once and repacked the sock on that foot, folding an extra layer under the heel, which helped for approximately half a mile before the padding compressed and the cold returned. She kept moving because movement was the only resource she had. The hills to the west of the valley road began changing character around mid-afternoon. The rounded cultivated slopes near the farmsteads gave way to steeper, rockier ground where the timber had never been cleared. Old growth mixed with younger second-growth pine and hemlock, pressing close to the ridgeline boulders jutting from the hillside at angles that suggested the kind of geological violence that had shaped the whole range. Clara had looked at those hills for 6 years from the farmhouse windows without ever climbing them. They had always existed as backdrop, as context, as the edge of the valley rather than a place in their own right. She began thinking about them now with a different kind of attention. The road to Keller's Crossing would not get her there before dark. She had known this for the last 2 hours, but had been carrying the knowledge without fully examining it, the way a person carries a stone in their shoe for longer than makes sense because stopping to address it requires admitting the full extent of the inconvenience. The arithmetic was simple and unambiguous: 4 miles covered in 4 hours of deteriorating conditions, 7.5 miles remaining daylight gone in approximately 2 hours. She would be walking in full darkness on a road she couldn't see in conditions that were still worsening, with a failing boot and no shelter. The alternative was the hillside. People stayed on roads in bad weather because roads offered speed and direction. Roads made sense. Heading uphill into old-growth timber in a snowstorm made no immediate sense, but the hills west of the valley offered something the road did not: vertical structure. Pines with their canopies deflecting the snowfall rock formations that interrupted the wind, the possibility of sufficient cover to survive a night. Not comfort, not warmth. Survival, which was a different category entirely. She left the road at a point where a gap in the fence line allowed access to a meadow that sloped gently upward toward the heavier timber. Her boots punched through the crust of accumulated snow, with each step the work harder than the road had been, the footing uncertain over ground she couldn't see beneath the white. She crossed the meadow and endured the trees, and the quality of the air changed, immediately damper under the canopy, the sound of the wind reduced to a sound occurring somewhere above her rather than directly against her skin. She climbed. The grade steepened faster than she had anticipated. What had looked from the valley floor like a gradual rise became at ground level a series of short pitches interrupted by flat benches, the rock formations creating natural terracing that made the going irregular rather than steady. She slipped on the first significant pitch, catching herself on a hemlock trunk, the rough bark scraping her palm. She adjusted her line and went wider around the next section, reading the snow surface for the subtle color differences that sometimes indicated ice underneath versus packed snow versus loose powder over air gaps. She fell twice. The second fall was harder, both knees hitting stone beneath the snow, and she stayed still for a moment on hands and knees, with her breath coming fast and the cold radiating up through her palms, doing a kind of internal inventory. Nothing broken, pain in both knees sharpest on the left. She got up and kept moving. The light was going wrong. Not gone, there was still enough diffused winter light filtering through the canopy to see by, but it was going the wrong color. The flat gray deepening toward the blue-gray that preceded full dark, and she was not where she needed to be. She had been climbing for over an hour and had not found anything usable. A fallen tree lay nearby, but its canopy had already shed most of its needles and offered no real coverage. A rock overhang she had aimed for from 30 feet away proved up close to be shallow enough that the wind curved under it. She pressed her back against the stone anyway and caught her breath and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with panic. Panic was expensive, and she could not afford it, that she was running short of margin. The cold that had been at her periphery had moved inward. She could feel it across her shoulders now, inside the collar, the place where the coats had gaps. Cold inside clothing was the indicator her father had described, the one that meant the system was losing. She was sweating from the climb, and her underlayer was damp, and the temperature continued falling, and the combination of those three facts produced a timeline that she could feel rather than calculate, and the timeline was short. She needed something real, not an overhang, not a fallen tree, something built. She was looking for anything, her eyes moving across the hillside in the practiced way of someone trying to extract information from poor conditions when she saw the shape. At first, it refused to become what it was. Her mind processed it as shadow, as a trick of the failing light against the hill face, as the dark negative space where a section of snow had slid from beneath an overhang and left exposed earth. A rectangle of dark against the hillside's white and gray, partially obscured by the low branches of a hemlock that had grown up close to whatever it was, and partially buried by a drift that had built against it over the course of the storm. She moved toward it without deciding to move, pulled by the shape of the thing by its edges, which were too straight for anything geology produced on its own. 15 feet away, she stopped. It was a door. Old wood gray, black with age and weather, set into the hillside at the base of a rise of earth that was not quite natural. She could see it now. The deliberate shaping of the ground, the way the slope curved over the structure in a manner that spoke of intent rather than accident. The hillside here had been built, not found. The curve overhead was too regular, the compaction of the soil too even. Whoever had constructed this had known what they were doing and had known it for long enough to do it carefully. She closed the remaining distance in seconds. The door frame was rough-hewn timber, dark and dense, the grain tight in the way of old hardwood that had dried slowly over decades. A band of iron ran across the door's middle, and the handle was iron as well, a simple latch designed, the metal cold enough that when she gripped it without thinking, it burned her bare palm. She pulled back, pulled her coat sleeve down over her hand, and tried again. The door did not move. She leaned her shoulder into it and pushed instead of pulling, and felt the faintest give, not the door opening, but the frame responding wood that had swollen in the moisture and the cold. She stepped back, got her shoulder properly aligned, and drove against it with her full weight. The sound it made was somewhere between a groan and a sigh, wood and hinges and time yielding together. And the door swung inward several inches and released a breath of air that stopped her completely. Not cold air, not warm air, something between the two, cool, the way a root cellar was cool, the stable coolness of earth that did not participate in the temperature extremes happening above it, air that had been sitting still and protected for a long time. She put her face into the gap and breathed it in, and her body recognized before her mind fully processed the recognition that this air was not hostile. It was the first non-hostile thing she had encountered in hours. She pushed the door further open. Darkness descended ahead of her by way of rough stone steps, 6 of them visible before they turned, and the darkness became complete. The space beyond smelled of old wood and dry earth, and something she couldn't name, not rot, not animal, something older and cleaner than either. She stood at the threshold with the wind pushing at her back and the darkness in front of her, and understood that she was at a decision point of the exact kind her father had warned her about. Not the dramatic kind that appeared obviously as a choice, the subtle kind where the most dangerous option and the most tempting option were the same option. People disappeared in places like this. Structures collapsed, filled with bad air, housed animals that did not want company. An underground space with a door that hadn't opened easily in some time could be any of those things. The fact that it existed did not mean it was safe, and the fact that she wanted it to be safe was exactly the kind of reasoning that got people killed. The wind answered before she finished the thought, pushing hard against her back in a gust that drove cold straight through both coats at once and reminded her with the blunt efficiency of physical reality what the alternative was. She went in, pulling the door shut behind her. The difference was immediate and total. Not warmth, she wasn't warm, but the cessation of wind, the cessation of the sensory assault that had been continuous for hours. The sound of the storm became something occurring at a distance, muffled by layers of earth and timber, reduced from a physical threat to an abstract awareness. She stood on the third step with the door closed behind her and the darkness complete around her, and she breathed slowly, and the air continued to be what it had been, not hostile. She found the matches in the pack's front pocket, where she kept them wrapped in wax cloth. 3 matches, which was what she had. She cupped her hands and struck the first one. The flame guttered, caught, steadied, In its small radius of light, she saw the steps continuing down and turning left at the bottom. She descended carefully, one hand on the stone wall that was rough and cold and dry, the match burning toward her fingers before she reached the bottom and turned the corner and stopped. The chamber was larger than any reasonable expectation could have produced. The ceiling arched overhead in a curve reinforced by heavy timber beams, the wood black with age, each beam notched and seated into the stone walls, with the kind of joinery that required knowledge and patience rather than speed. The walls themselves were stone, for the lower portion packed earth above, and the earth was dry, not damp. The match in her fingers illuminated the room in sweeping amber, a wall of shelving on the far side shelves of raw board fixed between stone uprights, and on those shelves rows of sealed jars, dozens of them. The match burned her fingers. The room went dark. She stood in the dark for a moment orienting. Then she struck the second match. More deliberately this time. She needed to see without burning through her supply, so she moved her gaze in a deliberate sweep rather than letting it scatter. The shelves held jars of various sizes, quart jars and pint jars, some clouded with age, some clear contents she could not identify from this distance without approaching. Below the shelves, burlap sacks that were the right shape and weight for grain, a wooden crate with the top nailed down. Two barrels pushed against the wall, sealed with wax-coated cloth. Root vegetables, she could see them now nestled in what appeared to be packed sand in an open crate near the floor. Some shriveled at the skin, but others still firm. To her left, a small iron stove, squat and black, with a stovepipe running up and angling into the earth through a section of the ceiling where the stone had been cut to accommodate it. Beside the stove, stacked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that disorder was its own kind of cost, split wood dry, the ends pale and unweathered. Not a cord, but enough. Enough for days. The match burned out. In the dark, she found the stove by memory and touch, moving slowly, and confirmed that the pipe ran true and that the firebox was clean, dry ash, which meant the last fire built here had been built properly, banked, and allowed to burn fully rather than smothered. Beside the wood stack, she found what her fingers identified as a tin box. She opened it without the benefit of light and confirmed by touch the slender shape of a fire starter, the loose feeling of tinder scraps, the smooth flat edge of folded paper. She used her third and last match to examine what she'd found. Birch bark tinder still dry, old newspaper folded to quarter size. The fire starter was a piece of flint in a steel striker bound together with a strip of worn leather. Whoever had left this room had left it ready for someone to return to. Every item was positioned for rapid use. She sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor in the dark and opened the stove's door and began building the fire with the disciplined patience of someone who understood that this was the most important thing happening in the world at this moment. Tinder first arranged not in a pile, but in a loose nest with space for air to circulate. Folded newspaper below it for sustained ignition, not on top where it would smother. 3 pieces of the smallest diameter wood she could find by feel, arranged at angles above the tinder. One larger piece laid across the back of the firebox to serve as a base that would hold heat rather than burn up immediately. She struck the flint and steel together in the darkness. Sparks. More sparks. Then a spark caught the birch bark and held, and she leaned in and blew the faintest possible breath across it, not extinguishing but feeding, and the spark became a flame that moved into the tinder and the newspaper and began doing what fire did when it was given what it needed to do it properly. She almost added more wood too soon. Her hand was already moving toward the larger pieces when she caught herself the instinct to accelerate when things were working, to push the success while it was happening. She kept her hand back, let the small pieces establish themselves, let the heat build in the firebox rather than up the pipe. When the wood had been burning for several minutes and the iron was beginning to tick with heat expansion, she added a medium piece, then another, and closed the stove door halfway to regulate the draw. Smoke rose through the pipe in the right direction. The draft was good, Someone had chosen this location and built this chimney run with knowledge of how underground spaces handle combustion, how to vent without creating draw problems. The stove had been built by someone who had built it right. Warmth began entering the room. Not rushing, nothing in here worked at the pace of the world outside. The heat came slowly and evenly, radiating from the iron, in a way that was entirely different from the violent fluctuations she'd been navigating for hours. She let the stove work and turned to the shelves. She went through the jars methodically, beginning at the left end of the upper shelf and working right, setting each jar on the floor briefly while she examined the seal in the growing firelight. Many were intact, many were cold and firm, and showed no sign of the bulging or cloudiness that indicated spoilage. But not all of them. She set 3 jars aside immediately. Their lids had the subtle dome of fermentation, the contents clouded in the wrong way, the smell when she held them near her face, carrying the sharp wrongness of things that had turned. A 4th jar she held longer before deciding it was probably fine, then deciding probably was not good enough, and adding it to the discard row. When she finished, roughly a third of the jars she'd examined were either certainly bad or questionable enough to avoid. The remaining 2/3 represented more food than she could have hoped to find. She opened a quart jar of preserved carrots. The seal broke with a sound that was sharp and clean, the lid coming off properly, and the brine that had kept them smelled of dill and salt and nothing that concerned her. She ate 3 pieces, slowly chewing longer than necessary, and the taste of something real after hours of cold bread and effort produced a physical response she had not anticipated. Not tears exactly, but something adjacent to them, a release of tension from muscles she had not known were braced. She removed her boots. The left one came off with the sock partially frozen to the leather at the toe, and when she peeled the sock back, the skin of her foot was a pale waxen color that alarmed her. She held the foot near the stove, not touching the iron, not close enough to be burned, close enough for the radiant heat to begin reversing what the cold had started. The tingling that followed was worse than the numbness, had been sensation returning the way it always did through discomfort, as though warmth needed to announce itself by causing pain before it could cause relief. She found the bunk against the rear wall, folded blankets on top, stiff with age, the wool compressed and smelling of cedar, and the particular dustiness of things stored properly for a long time, not decayed stored. She shook one out, and the smell lightened, and she wrapped it around her shoulders without lying down yet, because she needed to understand what this place was before she surrendered to the exhaustion that had been accumulating since she left the farmyard. The wooden box was on the lower shelf, pushed back toward the wall, wrapped in a piece of canvas tied with twine. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside the box, a ledger. The cover was simple, bored dark from handling the pages, thick and slightly yellowed at the edges. She opened it to the first page and angled it toward the firelight coming through the stove's grate. The handwriting was precise and narrow, the letters slightly forward-leaning, the kind of script produced by someone who had been taught to write carefully and had continued practicing because writing carefully mattered to them. The name at the top of the first page was Silas Dunmore. The first entries were dated from a winter 13 years before. They were practical in a way she recognized immediately, the practicality of someone who took record-keeping seriously, because records were not vanity, but tools. Outside temperature in the morning, noted in degrees estimated by the feel of the air rather than a thermometer. Wood remaining noted by counting the split pieces in the stack. How much oil had been consumed by the lantern in a single evening. How long the potatoes in the sand crate had lasted before showing softness. She read these entries with the attention she might have given a textbook she'd been told she would be tested on later, because each piece of information was a data point about this room, about what it could provide, and for how long and under what conditions. Between the practical entries, explanations. Brief, plainly stated. Built the shelter in winter of 1876 when the cold came early and stayed too long. Ground holds temperature steady where air does not. Most people who die in winter die because they wait until the danger is already upon them to prepare against it. They are not lazy people or foolish people. They are people who trusted that things would remain as they had been, that the world would continue to cooperate. And by the time the world stopped cooperating, it was too late to build what they needed. She read this twice, then as she read on. Silas Dunmore had lived alone in these hills after the winter of 1873, when a diphtheria outbreak had moved through the valley and taken his wife and both of his children in the span of 10 days. He had stayed in the valley for 3 years after that, working the farm, attending the church in Keller's Crossing, going through the motions of a life that no longer had the center it had been organized around. Then he had stopped going through the motions and had moved up into the hills instead, and he had built this shelter not as a hiding place from people, but as an answer to a problem that had been building in him since the winter of 1873. The problem of how a person continued to exist in a world that had already demonstrated its capacity for total and sudden reversal. The shelter was not refuge. It was preparation turned into architecture. She turned pages carefully. The entries continued through several winters, each one teaching her something additional: how the earth walls managed moisture differently from wood, how the root vegetables stored in sand lasted longer than those stored in straw, how the stovepipe's angle affected the draw in different wind conditions. Silas had been running experiments and recording results with the rigor of someone who understood that the information might matter later to someone who needed it. Partway through the ledger, a different kind of entry, a paragraph rather than a list. Thomas Wren came up the hill yesterday looking for his dog, which had been chasing something into the timber. He found me instead, and we talked for a while. He is a good man, careful with his words, pays attention to things most people look past. His daughter is 9 or 10, red-haired, serious. He worries about what would happen to her if something happened to him. I told him a man who worries about that is the right kind of man. Clara stopped reading. She read the paragraph again. Her father's name written by a man she had never met in a ledger, in a shelter she had found by stumbling through a blizzard after being cast out of the only house she had known. Her father coming up this same hillside with the same kind of purpose she had, though his purpose had been different, lighter, a lost dog rather than a vanished future. And his daughter mentioned a child she could barely remember being named in another person's careful handwriting. She read on. Thomas came back twice more this winter to help with the timber work on the secondary storage room. He does not take payment. He says helping with a thing like this is its own kind of payment, that someday the thing might be needed in a way neither of us can predict. He thinks carefully about future necessity, which is rarer than it should be. I gave him the old hunting knife I have been carrying since the war, the one with the maker's mark. It was good steel, and I had a better one now, and he needed a good knife more than I needed too. Clara's hand went to the pack's side pocket, the burlap around the handle, the 2 letters pressed into the steel near the hilt. S.D. Silas Dunmore. The knife was not a blacksmith's mark. It was the man's initials. The man who had built this room. The man who had written her father's name with care and respect in a ledger that Clara was now holding in a shelter she had found because she had no other option, on the same hillside where her father had come years before he died. The connection pressed against her in a way she could not fully accommodate, too large to examine all at once, so she held only the edges of it and let the rest stay outside her understanding for the moment. The final entry in the ledger was dated 2 years ago. The leg has not improved as I hoped. The cold makes it considerably worse. I need supplies, lamp oil in particular, and salt before the next heavy snowfall. Going into Keller's Crossing tomorrow morning first light. If weather holds back by afternoon. If weather does not hold, I will shelter at the Hollis farm on the way back. Either way, I intend to be here before the hard snow. The sentence after that was incomplete. It broke mid-phrase, the pen line trailing off to the right, as though it had been set down mid-thought and never picked up again. She closed the ledger and sat with it in her lap and listened to the stove and the distant murmured weather above, and understood what the incomplete sentence meant. He had not come back. Not the next day, not after the storm, not in 2 years. The room had been waiting since then, supplied and ready for a return that hadn't happened. Her father's friend had built a thing intended to sustain life and had not survived to use it himself. He had prepared for every contingency he could name and had been ended by one he hadn't. This room was what remained of him, not ruins, not decay, but a fully functioning argument that the world could be prepared for, constructed over years of careful thought and left here in the hillside like a letter to whoever came after. She set the ledger back in its box, in the box on the shelf, and looked around the room in the stove's strengthening light. The walls were dry, the ceiling held. The warmth was real and steady, and coming from fuel that had been waiting here for whoever needed it. Most of the jars on the shelves were still sound. She had survived the walk and the cold and the fall and the failing boot and the darkness, and she was here, and here was better than anywhere else she could be. She should leave, she thought. This room belonged to someone or to someone's estate or to some legal claim she couldn't evaluate. She was 17 years old and she had arrived uninvited and had eaten from a jar that wasn't hers and was burning wood that she hadn't split. The thought lasted approximately as long as thoughts lasted when they were outweighed by physical reality. She was not leaving. Outside, the storm was pressing harder against the hill. She could feel it in the way the stove drew when a gust moved over the pipe's exit point, a subtle variation in the quality of the combustion. She was dry. She was warming. Tomorrow existed again in a way it hadn't an hour ago. There was a lantern on the shelf, old tin, with a reservoir of oil that she tipped and found still contained enough to burn for a while. She lowered it from the stove's grate and set it on the shelf facing outward, and the room filled with a steadier, warmer light than the stove's glow alone had provided. The shelves resolved into sharper detail. The barrels and sacks took on more specific shape. The room stopped being a darkness that had allowed her in and became something she could see clearly for the first time. She lay down on the bunk and pulled two blankets over her and looked at the curved timber ceiling above her. And for a long moment before sleep, she held the thought of what she was looking at. Not just boards and earth, not just someone else's preparation. A system built by a person who had understood that surviving a serious winter required more than endurance, more than stubbornness, more than the willingness to keep moving when everything around you said to stop. It required having already built the conditions for your own survival before the test arrived. Most people trusted that they would manage when the time came. Silas Dunmore had refused that trust and built something instead. The storm moved overhead. The earth held. The fire in the stove settled into the steady pulse of sustained combustion. Outside, somewhere on the hillside above her, the snow continued covering the ground, in which a man who had known her father was lying, undiscovered, 2 years into a return that had never completed itself. She did not know that yet. She slept. She woke once in the night to feed the stove, moving without full consciousness. Through the process, 3 pieces of mid-sized wood, the door closed to a narrow gap. The draw checked by listening for the particular sound that indicated good airflow versus poor. She registered all of this and returned to the bunk without lighting the lantern and was asleep again in the time it took the wood to fully catch. When she woke the second time, there was no change in the light because there was no natural light. The room was sealed from outside, windowless, lit only by what she gave it. But her body knew morning, the way bodies did by the shift in something less nameable than light, perhaps the subtle change in the quality of air, or simply the accumulated hours. She lay still for a while and ran through the inventory she had made the previous night. Wood, oil, food, water. She had not yet located water, which was a gap. She could melt snow, but that required going outside, and currently outside was the problem. She found the water in the second small room, which she had not explored the previous night. The room extended behind and to the left of the main chamber, a narrow space cut further into the hillside, accessible through an opening she had noticed only as a dark gap. Inside, 4 barrels she had assumed were sealed dry goods. 2 of them were. The other 2 contained water cold cleaned the surface in one of them, bearing a thin skin of ice that she broke with her knuckle and confirmed clear water below. The barrels had been sealed with a cloth tight enough to keep debris out, but not so tight as to prevent access. They were not full. Someone had used from them over the last winter they'd been here and had not topped them off before leaving. But they were enough. She spent the morning going through the secondary storage room fully. More sacks grain she identified as barley by the smell when she opened the seam slightly. A crate of tools under canvas. An axe. A short-handled camp saw a tin of mixed hardware hinges, nails of various sizes, a coil of wire, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, joists on loops of twine, the herbs riddled with age but still identifiable by scent. Sage dried mint, something she recognized as yarrow from the way it had flowered before it was cut and dried. Aunt Marin had used yarrow for poultices. The knowledge felt pointed in a way she didn't spend time examining. What struck her most moving through the space was not the abundance, because it was not abundance exactly. It was sufficiency calculated and calibrated, but the evidence of sustained intention. Someone had come back here repeatedly over years to assess, to replenish, to repair. The wood stack showed different ages of wood, suggesting it had been added to over multiple seasons. The water barrels had the wear of regular handling. The shelves had been built and then modified, and extra support added to one section where a board had begun to sag. This was not a place someone had stocked once and forgotten. This was a place someone had tended. She returned to the ledger for the practical entries, reading them now less as biography and more as instruction. How long did the preserved carrots last before the seals became questionable? He had noted this sealed properly and kept cool. 18 months before he would begin to watch them closely, up to 2 years before he would not eat from a jar without checking the smell. She had opened a jar the previous night, a jar she estimated was 2 years old at most, based on the final entry date. The seal had been good. The smell had been right. She filed this away as confirmation. How much wood did the stove consume in a full cold night? He had noted this too in his careful way, with the honest variation that real observation produced between 8 and 12 pieces of the split hardwood, depending on the outside temperature and how well the door was managed. She had used 7 pieces in the night, which fit the lower end of his range. This told her that the stack she had found, she counted it at approximately 40 pieces of full split and another 20 of kindling, would last 4 days if she was the only person using the stove and managed it carefully. 6 days if she was very careful and the temperature outside moderated. She did not think the temperature was going to moderate. She ate from one of the sound jars at midday green beans, this time milder than the carrots eaten cold, because warming them required a pot, and she had located the single pot in the tool crate and decided against using the water from the barrel for cooking when she was not yet certain about resupply. The economy of the decision felt right, not deprivation calibration. In the afternoon, she tried the door. The world outside had changed entirely. The storm had continued building through the night, in the morning, and the snow that had been accumulating when she descended into the shelter was now a transformed landscape, white smooth over everything, the contours of the hillside simplified by accumulation, the individual rocks and stumps, and variations in terrain that she had picked her way across the previous afternoon, buried under a surface that looked traversable and was not. A drift had built against the door's exterior face, and when she pushed it open, she pushed 12 inches of packed snow with it, and the cold came in like a decision being made by something much larger than herself. She looked at the hillside below her. The meadow she had crossed was gone. The fence line she had passed through was gone. The road at the valley's floor was a suggestion, a line of slightly different texture in the white expanse, visible only because she knew it was there and could infer it from the buildings on either side. No one was moving in the valley. No smoke rose from the Briggs farm to the east or the Holloway property further south. Either they were managing or they were not, but they were not moving. She closed the door and secured the latch and went back down. The realization settled in over the next hour. Not dramatically, but with the quiet weight of mathematical certainty, she was not going to Keller's Crossing tomorrow morning. She was not going to Keller's Crossing until the storm broke and the roads cleared and the temperature rose enough to make the journey survivable rather than theoretical. This could be 2 days, it could be a week. Winter in the Allegheny Ridges did not consult anyone's plans, and this storm had the feel of one that had committed itself. She was going to be here for a while. The thought produced after the initial moment of confronting it, something she had not expected, not dread, but a clarifying kind of stillness. The decision had been made by the weather. She did not have to decide anything except how to manage what she had, and managing resources was something she understood. She had been managing insufficient resources for 6 years. She refed the stove and banked it for the evening and ate a measured amount from 2 of the sound jars and drank a cup of water from the barrel and lay on the bunk with the ledger open on her chest without reading, staring at the arched ceiling. The wood groaned occasionally as the temperature outside continued to drop and the timbers responded. The earth around her did not groan. The earth simply held as it had held for the years this room had existed, as it would hold after she was gone, indifferent to the urgency of whatever was happening on its surface. She thought about her father walking up this same hillside with the casual purpose of looking for a dog. She thought about him sitting with Silas Dunmore and talking. She thought about the knife passing from one man's hand to another as a kind of gratitude, some exchange that could not be completed with words alone, and so required an object to carry it. She thought about the incomplete sentence at the end of the ledger, the pen line trailing off. Outside, the storm pressed down on the hillside with indiscriminate force, taking no particular interest in the wooden door set into the earth or in the girl on the other side of it, who was learning in the steadily accumulating warmth of a dead man's preparation that survival and luck in suffering traveled together in ways that could not be planned for but only eventually recognized. She did not sleep yet. She fed the stove once more and lay listening to the fire and the weather, and her mind moved through what she knew about this room and what she suspected and what she still needed to learn. And she began without quite deciding to begin to plan for the possibility that she would not be the only person who needed it before the storm was finished. The valley below had not prepared. She had seen it in 6 years of watching from the farmhouse window, the casual confidence of people who had managed every previous winter and therefore expected to manage this one. The Hollis family with their exposed woodpile uncovered beside the barn, the Briggs property with its single storage shed already close to full, but not insulated against extended cold. The way the whole valley assumed that movement between households would remain possible, that neighbors could reach neighbors, that the network of ordinary daily traffic would continue to function as it always had. She had thought all winter that the valley was not ready. She had thought it the way she thought many things quietly without saying them, because saying them to Earl had not been a feature of the life she was living. The valley was not ready, and the storm had arrived, and she was here in the one place on this hillside, or in this valley that had been built for exactly this. The fire burned, the earth held, the snow fell. She was still awake when the first hour of what would become a very long night finally passed. The second day began with an inventory she did not need to take again, but took anyway because the act of counting is also the act of thinking, and she needed to think clearly before the storm decided anything else for her. 41 pieces of split hardwood remaining after the night, 32 sound jars across both shelves, the compromise ones set in a separate corner where she wouldn't reach for them by mistake. 2 barrels of water, one roughly 2/3 full, one closer to half. The barley sack was heavier than she'd estimated. She pressed her fist into the grain and felt it give the way full sacks gave and revised her estimate upward. The potatoes in the sand crate were a mixed count, 16 firm enough to use without reservation, 9 that needed using quickly before they softened past the point of safety. 7 she set aside as losses. The losses she noted without sentiment. Sentiment about spoiled food was a luxury that changed nothing. She had enough for one person for 3 weeks, rationed carefully. She had already understood, lying awake through the previous night's final hours, that one person was not the permanent condition she was planning for. The storm did not break on the second day. She climbed the steps twice, once at mid-morning, once at what she estimated was mid-afternoon, based on the changing quality of cold at the door's edges, and both times the world outside was white and horizontal and indifferent. The drift against the door had grown. She packed it back down from the inside to keep the door functional and descended again and sat beside the stove with the ledger. She was not rereading for sentiment this time. She was reading for engineering. Silas had written about the shelter's construction across several entries, spanning what appeared to be 2 winters of work, and the entries were specific in ways that mattered to her now. The ceiling's arch was load-bearing by design, not an accident. He had studied the technique from a book on mine construction and adapted it for a smaller scale, distributing the weight of the hillside above into the stone walls rather than relying on the timber beams to bear it directly. The beams were reinforcement, not support. This was why the ceiling was dry, where a flat roof would have wept moisture. The arch shed lateral pressure, and the gap between the soil cap and the stone prevented groundwater from finding a direct path inward. The stovepipe ran at an angle Silas had calculated through trial and error across 2 winters, steep enough to draw without resistance, angled away from the prevailing wind's approach vector so that gusts crossing the hill's crest would not create backdraft. Every piece of it had been thought through and then tested and then adjusted. This was not a man who had read about survival. This was a man who had practiced it until the practice became reliable. She found the section on ventilation on the 14th page. The shelter had a secondary vent, not obvious, not labeled, but described in one of the practical entries as a small opening cut through the earth on the opposite side of the hill from the stovepipe covered with a fitted stone that could be shifted from inside to allow air exchange without opening the main door. He had installed it after a winter evening when he had built the fire too hot, too fast, and the oxygen in the sealed room had depleted enough to make him lightheaded before he had identified the cause. The vent was not for warmth. It was for the quality of the air when the room was occupied by more than one person. She found the stone on the third try, pressing along the back wall above the secondary storage room until a section moved differently under her hand. Not solid earth, but a fitted plug with a slight gap around its edge. She shifted it half an inch, and cold air entered in a thin, clean stream. She shifted it back to a quarter-inch gap and left it there. She had not known she needed that. She knew it now. On the third day, she began rationing the lantern oil more aggressively, burning it only during the hours she was actively working rather than letting it run for comfort, and discovered that the stove's firelight, once she adjusted to navigating by it, was sufficient for most of the tasks she was performing. Her eyes adapted. Darkness became relative rather than absolute, and she began moving through the rooms with the confidence of someone learning a space by repetition rather than by sight. She cataloged the tool crate thoroughly. Beyond the axe and saw she had already noted, she found a coil of braided rope, a good quality whetstone still with oil in its storage tin, and a folding ruler of the type surveyors and carpenters used, which she took as further evidence of who Silas Dunmore had been, the kind of man who brought measuring tools into the wilderness because imprecision was a habit he refused to accommodate. She used the whetstone on her father's knife, working the blade in long strokes from heel to tip at the angle the edge told her it wanted, and the sound of steel against stone in the underground quiet was the most human sound the room had contained since she'd arrived. When the edge was right, she tested it against a piece of rope, and the rope parted cleanly, and she sheathed the knife and felt in a way she couldn't have articulated without it sounding smaller than it was that she had done something for him. For the man who had walked this hillside looking for a lost dog and come home with a friend's knife in his pack and never explained where it came from. The storm peaked on the third night. She felt it change before she heard it, a shift in the stove's draw. The draft suddenly stronger, pulling harder than it had in 2 days, which she had learned meant the wind outside was intensifying across the pipe's exit point. Then the sound, not the steady pressure she had been sleeping through, but something with surges in it, intervals of quieter pressure, followed by impacts that she could feel transmitted through the earth itself, the hillside above her, absorbing blows from weather that had gathered real violence. She fed the stove to full capacity and put herself on the bunk and listened. Then the smoke came, not rushing, arriving gradually the way the most dangerous things arrived, incrementally enough that her mind kept revising the threshold of concern upward rather than acknowledging the accumulation. She noticed it first as a smell, then as a slight haziness at the top of the stove's immediate light radius, then as the particular irritation at the back of her throat that was not dryness, but displacement of clean air by combustion product. She went to the stovepipe connection and put her hand near the seam and felt the warm outflow of gases going in the wrong direction. Not the pipe drafting upward as it should, but gases being pushed back down and into the room as the wind outside overwhelmed the natural draw. The pipe's exit point had been compromised. Either the wind angle had shifted enough to create direct backdraft, or more likely, given what she had felt through the earth, the pipe's exterior end had been packed by drifting snow during the storm's intensification, until the opening was sufficiently blocked that pressure built in the pipe and reversed. She went to the vent stone and shifted it fully open, which helped the room's air quality immediately, but did not solve the pipe problem, and stood in the main chamber doing the arithmetic of the situation, the way she had done the arithmetic of the walk on the road without panic, because panic was arithmetic that stopped working. The fire could not be maintained in a room filling with combustion gases. Extinguishing the fire and relying on the Earth's passive thermal mass to hold temperature was survivable for some number of hours. Silas had documented the room's temperature drop rate in a sealed, fireless condition on 2 separate occasions, and she had read both entries carefully enough to recall that in severe cold, the room lost approximately 10 degrees in the first 4 hours without the stove, then slowed as the thermal mass of the earth walls stabilized. 4 hours was enough time to do something, but not enough time to do nothing. She put on both coats. She took the whetted knife and put it in her pocket. She checked that the rope in the tool crate was still where she had seen it. She packed 1 piece of bread into her coat's inner pocket because the calculation was simple. If the thing she was about to do went wrong enough to take more than 10 minutes, she would need something in her stomach when she came back. If she came back. She climbed the stairs and unlatched the door, and the storm entered the stairwell with the force of something that had been waiting for the opening. The wind was a different animal at ground level than it had been as sound through the earth. It hit her sideways, and she grabbed the door frame with both hands and oriented, turning her face away from the direct impact and breathing through the collar of her coat, which she had pulled up to her eyes. The snow was not falling so much as moving horizontally, fine and dense, the flakes too small and fast to be individual things, the whole mass of it a single medium through which she had to navigate, rather than a precipitation event she could see through. She had noted the stovepipe's exit location on the hillside above the door on the second day during one of her exterior assessments, specifically because she had been thinking about the structural entries in the ledger and had wanted to confirm the pipe's angle against what Silas had described. The pipe emerged from the hill's crest approximately 30 feet above the door and 8 feet to the left, marked by a low stone collar Silas had built to keep rodents and debris from entering the opening. She had noted it as information then. She was grateful for it now. 30 feet uphill in a blizzard was not 30 feet on a clear afternoon. The slope she had descended easily while checking the door was now a surface she could not see and could barely stand on the accumulated snow, slick and irregular beneath her boots, the wind pushing her sideways every time she committed weight to a step. She went slowly. She went on hands and knees for part of the steeper section, and she reached the stone collar in what she estimated was 7 or 8 minutes, though time in those conditions compressed and expanded in unreliable ways. The collar was packed. Not entirely. The wind had been inconsistent enough that snow had drifted against one side while leaving the other relatively clear, and the actual pipe opening at the center of the collar was blocked by a compressed mass of wind-driven snow that had entered and accumulated rather than drifting over. She dug it out with the folding ruler she had taken from the tool crate, which was the right length and rigidity for the worm, clearing the ice-mixed snow from the pipe's opening and packing it back into the collar's drainage gap where it would be carried away from the opening rather than reaccumulating immediately. Her hands had gone past cold into the specific numbness that was its own kind of warning. She tested the pipe with her palm, held 2 inches above the opening, and felt the faint warmth of outflow returning, not strong, yet not the full draw that would come once the pressure differential reestablished, but the direction was right again. She descended in less time than it had taken to ascend, moving faster. Now that the purpose was completed and the coal was demanding acceleration, and she hit the door and got inside it and pulled it shut behind her and stood in the stairwell with the storm on one side of the door and the underground chamber on the other, and allowed herself 30 seconds of simply being out of the wind before moving. The smoke had thinned. She rebuilt the fire from the banked coals she had managed to keep alive before going out, working carefully, adding wood in the sequence that established heat before adding to it, and sat back on the floor in front of the open firebox door with her hands extended toward the heat and let the sensation return to her fingers through the usual route of discomfort, announcing warmth. Later, she would think about how close the margins had been, the moment she had noticed the smoke and recognized it correctly rather than explaining it away, the decision to go out rather than wait and see, the 8 minutes on the hillside in conditions that did not want her there. The way a piece of information she had gathered 2 days earlier, the pipe's location noted almost idly, had become the difference between a manageable crisis and an unmanageable one. Preparation was only useful if you paid attention while conditions were good, because conditions would not stay good long enough to collect the information you needed once they turned. She wrote this in the back of Silas's ledger in the blank pages at the end that he had left unused. She used his pencil, which she had found in the box with the ledger. The handwriting looked nothing like his. Hers was less precise, more angular, but the words went down into the page and stayed, and adding them felt like continuing something rather than beginning something new. The fourth day brought the knock. She was at the shelves, rotating the jar inventory, moving the oldest of the sound jars to the front, so they would be used first when the sound arrived from the direction of the stairs. Faint, the kind of sound that could be explained away as structural noise, the hillside settling, a branch impact somewhere above. She held still. Then it came again 3 times with the rhythm of intent. She went up the stairs and opened the door 3 inches. Agnes Harlow was standing in the snow with her son Elliot pressed against her side, and both of them were the color of people who had been outside too long. Agnes was a woman Clara had seen in the valley for 6 years without speaking to more than occasionally. She was perhaps 10 years older than Clara, a widow since before Clara had arrived, known for keeping her property in better order than her husband had, and for being precise about debts and favors in the way that people were precise when they had learned that imprecision in those matters cost them. Her son Elliot was ate his cheeks, the bad red of prolonged cold, rather than healthy exertion, his coat too light for what the last 4 days had delivered. Agnes's voice came out smaller than the woman Clara associated with the voice. "We saw the smoke. We thought maybe hunters." Clara opened the door fully and stepped aside. Agnes moved past her without further conversation, one hand keeping Elliot moving ahead of her, and when they reached the bottom of the stairs and the warmth of the main chamber enclosed them both, they stopped, the body requiring its moment to believe what the temperature was telling it. Elliot made no sound. He simply stood in the orange light of the stove with his hands loose at his sides and his face doing something complicated that an 8-year-old face should not have to do. Clara heated water in the single pot and put dried sage in it, which was not tea, but was warm and had a smell that worked on the nervous system in the way that familiar smells worked when everything else was unfamiliar. Agnes wrapped both hands around the tin cup and did not drink immediately, only held it, and her color began returning from the outside inward. The valley, Agnes explained, was not managing well. She had come from the direction of the Briggs farm, where she had stopped to check on the family there before continuing uphill toward where she had seen the smoke that morning. The Briggs family was intact, but their wood supply was nearly exhausted. They had burned through 5 days of what they believed was a week's worth in 3 days because the sustained cold was more demanding than their estimate had accounted for. The road between farms was impassable. She had left her own farm that morning on foot because staying had felt more dangerous than moving, which she said with the particular flatness of someone describing a decision they had made under duress and were not yet certain was correct. Her farm's storage shed had taken a partial roof collapse under snow load the previous night. The majority of her canned goods were still accessible, but the cold was now entering through the damaged section faster than the wood stove in the main house could compensate for, and running the house stove at maximum to maintain temperature meant the wood was going faster than she could replenish it by hand without someone helping her, which she could not do because she was managing Elliot alone. Agnes looked around the chamber as she spoke her assessment, methodical and unawed. She was a practical woman, and what she was seeing was a practical thing. Extraordinary only in that it existed at all. Her voice was measured, a woman accounting for what was available rather than what she had hoped for. "How long have you been here?" 3 nights, Clara told her. She had found the shelter on the first night of the storm. Agnes looked at the shelves. "How much is there?" Clara told her what she had calculated. Agnes was quiet for a moment, doing her own arithmetic. For 2 people, it would last. For more than two, Clara said. She had already been calculating for more than two. Agnes looked at her directly for the first time since coming down the stairs, reevaluating something in the way that practical people did when reality arrived differently than expected. Clara was accustomed to being underestimated. She was accustomed to the particular beat of recalibration that preceded being seen more accurately. By evening, 2 more had arrived, a man and his adult daughter from the farm nearest the road's turning point, their house standing but their larder reduced to almost nothing after the father had miscounted their stores in the autumn and not discovered the discrepancy until the storm made the error irreversible. They came down the stairs with the careful slowness of people whose bodies were still processing the change in conditions, accepting it increment by increment rather than all at once. 6 people in the chamber by that first evening after Agnes's arrival. Clara had organized the space before they arrived in numbers, sleeping arrangements spread between the main room and the storage alcove, a rotation for proximity to the stove that she explained simply as fair use rather than as a rule, which was the same thing said differently with better results. She had rationed the evening's food before anyone was hungry enough to have opinions about portion size, which was also the same approach applied to the same principle. Ruth Calder arrived the following morning, coming down the stairs under her own power, despite being somewhere in her mid-50s and having walked a considerable distance in conditions that had stopped most people from attempting movement at all. She was a big-framed woman, wide through the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that entered rooms decisively even when the entry was as literal as a staircase underground. She stood in the main chamber and looked at the setup, the arranged sleeping spaces, the jars set out for the morning portion, the stove managed at the correct level, and then she looked at Clara. Ruth's voice, when she spoke, had the quality of a statement that contained a question, but refused to phrase itself as one, "Who put you in charge?" The room went quieter than it had been, which was noticeable because underground rooms were already quiet. Clara had been expecting something of this nature. Not from Ruth specifically, she had not known Ruth well enough to anticipate her specifically, but from the general condition of having organized things before anyone else arrived to have opinions about how they should be organized. Authority established by presence rather than by agreement was the kind of authority that invited challenge, and a woman of 55 with decades of managing her own property was not going to accept the arrangements of a 17-year-old girl without some form of interrogation. The air in the room waited. Clara kept her voice even, not placating but not defensive either. The tone of someone who had decided on an answer before the question arrived. "No one put me in charge of anything. The food needs counting and the wood needs managing, and someone needs to check the pipe before the fire is built up each evening. I've been doing those things because I was here first. Anyone who wants to do them differently is welcome to." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. The look was not hostile exactly. It was more like a structural test. the kind of examination a person applied to a claim before deciding whether to trust its weight. Agnes said from her position near the stove, "She went out in the storm 2 nights ago to clear the chimney pipe. Alone. We'd have been breathing smoke otherwise." Ruth absorbed this. She did not modify her expression significantly, but something in the quality of her stillness shifted. She sat down on the far end of the bunk she had identified as hers, without asking whether it was available, which was its own form of establishing terms, and she said nothing further on the subject of who had put Clara in charge. But the tension between them did not resolve, it relocated. It became the persistent friction of two people who understood the same kinds of things about managing resources and managing people, and were not yet certain they understood them the same way. Ruth took the water distribution the following morning without asking, simply picking up the water ladle and beginning to allocate the morning portion with the decisiveness of someone who knew exactly how much each person needed and had no patience for inefficiency. Clara watched this happen and did not object because the task was being done correctly and because giving Ruth a domain was a better outcome than contesting one. Garrett Hollis arrived on the 6th day of Clara's time in the shelter. He had his daughter with him, Nettie, who was 14, but moved and held herself in the compacted way of someone occupying as little space as possible, a posture Clara associated with prolonged exposure to difficult circumstances at an age when a person was still learning what shape they were supposed to be. Garrett was a broad man, gone slightly soft at the edges in the way of men who had worked hard for a long time and were now working slightly less hard and hadn't adjusted their eating accordingly. He came down the stairs looking at everything with the attention of someone assessing rather than simply observing, and he stopped in the doorway to the main chamber and took in the setup, the existing occupants, the arranged space, the stove running at the right level, and his face registered something he did not immediately voice. He knew Clara. Not well, but the way people in small valleys knew each other, by association, by proximity, by the accumulation of passing sightings over years. He knew she had been at the Sutter farm. He knew because everyone in the valley who paid attention knew that she had left the Sutter farm the morning the storm began. His voice carried the particular weight of a man choosing his words carefully because the alternative words were worse. "You've been here the whole time." Since the first night, Clara told him. He looked at the shelves, he looked at the lamp, he looked at Elliot, who was asleep in a corner with a blanket that was not his own, and at Agnes, who was mending a seam on her coat with thread from a spool Clara had found in the tool crate, and at Ruth, who was doing a count of the remaining wood with the systematic efficiency that Clara had come to recognize as Ruth's default mode of operating. Then he looked back at Clara, and something moved across his expression that she recognized, even though she did not see it often enough to have a precise name for it. It was the look of a person revising a category. She had been in a category: the girl from the Sutter farm, the girl who had been let go, the girl who needed looking after, and she was being moved out of it and into another one, and the transition was happening in real time on his face. Nettie had not spoken since coming down the stairs. She positioned herself in the corner farthest from the stove, not because it was the coldest corner it was, but because it was the corner that required acknowledgement from the fewest directions. She accepted the food Clara brought her without making eye contact, and she stayed in that corner through the evening while conversations moved around her like water around a stone. Clara did not push. She knew that particular stillness had worn it herself at various points in the last 6 years and understood that it was not rudeness and not coldness, but the specific self-protection of a person who had learned that taking up space invited more pain than contracting away from it. On the 7th night, the storm reasserted itself. Clara had thought it was weakening. The previous afternoon had brought a few hours of reduced intensity, the sound through the earth dampening the stove's draw, steadying the sense of something violent moving past rather than sitting overhead. She had let herself begin calculating the following morning as a possible time to make another exterior assessment, to begin thinking about what happened after. Then the 7th night arrived and erased that thinking entirely. The sound was different this time. Not the sustained pressure of the earlier days, but an intermittent violence gust of actual impact that could be felt as vibration in the stovepipe, where it met the ceiling, fitting that caused the lantern flame to flicker in its sealed glass despite being inside a sealed underground room, as though the storm was reaching through the earth itself to assert its presence. The stove's draw surged and dropped in the intervals between gusts, and Clara managed it carefully, reducing the fire to a maintained level that would not be affected by the pipe pressure variations. She had checked the pipe at midday. It was clear. She had checked the vent stone and confirmed it was positioned correctly. She had done, in other words, everything that preparation allowed, and what remained was the other thing, the thing preparation could not replace, but could only make endurable, which was waiting. Then the draw reversed again. Not gradually this time. It reversed in the space of a single gust that must have hit the pipe's exit at exactly the wrong angle, and the smoke came back not as a seeping presence, but as a visible plume from the stove's door seam, and the room reacted before Clara could speak. Elliot woke up coughing. Agnes had him against her chest and was already moving toward the stairs. Ruth went to the stove and reached for the door to damp the fire, and Clara said, "Stop," sharply enough that she did stop, because damping the fire incorrectly could trap combustion gases in the firebox and make the situation worse rather than better. Ruth's face did something then, not anger, which was what Clara expected, but a rapid recalculation, the face of a woman who was capable of being wrong and knew it. Garrett had already moved to the vent stone and shifted it fully open, which was the right instinct, and the fresh cold air that entered helped the room's quality almost immediately. But the pipe needed clearing from outside. Everyone in the room understood this. Agnes had told the story of Clara's first trip up the hillside with the accurate economy of someone who had been paying attention. The understanding moved through the room without anyone stating it directly. Clara was already dressed. She had kept both coats accessible since the first incident, not worn but within reach, which was the kind of preparation that looked like excessive caution until it wasn't. She pulled on the coats and wrapped her face, and Garrett stepped in front of the stairs. He was 6 inches taller than her and 40 pounds heavier, and he did not move like a man who was asking permission. "I'll go." Clara looked at him steadily. "You don't know where the pipe comes out." "A beat." "Then tell me." She thought about this in the 2-second interval that the situation allowed, which was enough time to recognize that the argument against sending him was pride, and the argument for sending him was every other consideration. She told him precisely where the pipe emerged. The stone collar, the distance and angle from the door, the left side 30 feet up, the way the collar's orientation affected how snow accumulated against it. She told him to use the folding ruler from the tool crate rather than his hands, because the ruler was the right instrument, and fingers in this temperature were not reliable tools. He was gone for 11 minutes. She counted by the cadence of the stove's breathing, which was irregular but present, and she managed the room in his absence by keeping people away from the stove and close to the vent, stone where the air was better. And she talked to Elliot about what it sounded like when a pipe was clearing, which was a fiction but a useful one, giving the boy something to listen for that was different from the sound of the storm. When the draw corrected itself, she felt it before Garrett returned, the fire deepening in the box, the smoke reversing the room's air quality, improving by increments. When he came back down the stairs, he was coated in snow and moving the way people moved when their core temperature had dropped enough to affect their gait. And Clara put him directly in front of the stove without ceremony and put a cup of the sage water in his hands and did not thank him, because the situation had not required gratitude and he did not look like a man who wanted it. Nettie had moved from her corner during Garrett's absence. Clara only noticed this after the immediate crisis had resolved. The girl was standing near the base of the stairs, her back against the wall, watching the room with an expression that was not the closed-off stillness of before, but something more like attention. She was watching the way things were managed, the way Clara had handled Elliot, the way the instructions had been given to Garrett, the way the stove was being brought back to operating temperature without being overloaded. When Garrett sat down fully and the room's immediate tension had released into the ordinary fatigue of people who had been frightened and were no longer frightened, but were still in the same situation that had been frightening. Nettie crossed the room. She picked up the second tin cup from the shelf where Clara had set it, and she poured water from the pot into it, and she walked it to where Clara was sitting on the floor managing the stove's door. She held it out. Her voice was almost inaudible under the sound of the weather above. "Thank you." Garrett looked at his daughter across the room. He looked the way parents looked when children did something that was also about the parent, not pride, exactly because pride implied a contribution, and what he was seeing was something Nettie had arrived at by herself without any instruction from him, and it was more than he had seen from her in 2 years. The night continued. The storm continued. The earth held what it had always held, the temperature between the too cold and the too warm, the air turning through the open vent in a slow exchange that kept the room livable. 9 people breathed the underground air, and the stove ran, and the wood supply decreased at a rate Clara tracked against her original estimate and found slightly worse than projected, but within a range that still left margin. She sat with the ledger in her lap after the others were asleep, and she wrote in the back pages again. Not about the night's events, which were already committed to her memory, with the kind of precision that high-stakes situations produced. She wrote about the water barrels which would need attention. Soon the level in the larger one was dropping faster than she had planned because 9 people required substantially more than one person, and she had been slow to revise her estimate when the numbers changed. This was the error she was most concerned about repeating. She wrote a plan built for one person does not become a plan for 9 by adding 8 people to it. It becomes a different plan. The pencil moved across Silas's blank pages, and the fire settled into its nighttime rhythm. And somewhere in the valley below, families who had not found a hillside door were managing through the same night with the resources they had rather than the resources they needed. And the distance between those two quantities was the exact width of the margin between enduring and not. She had known that margin existed. She had always known it existed. She was learning night by night that knowing it existed and being on the right side of it were not the same kind of knowing at all. On the 9th day, Amos Leach came down the stairs. She had not heard him knock. He had simply appeared at the top of the stairs at a moment when the main chamber had enough activity, Ruth distributing the morning water portion, Elliot asking Agnes something repeatedly in the way of children with questions that did not resolve that the sound of the door opening had been absorbed before anyone marked it. Clara noticed him when she turned from the stove and found a person at the bottom of the stairs she did not recognize. He was not dressed like the valley people. His coat was good wool city cut, and while it was wet at the shoulders from the current weather, it was the wet of a coat that had started in better condition than any coat she had seen in the last 9 days. He was perhaps 35, with a face that was not handsome, but was assembled in the way that it suggested he knew how to present it, the particular arrangement of someone who had practiced managing first impressions. He looked around the chamber with an expression that was not the overwhelmed relief of someone encountering warmth after deprivation. It was the expression of someone taking stock. He said he had been traveling when the storm caught him, a merchant route between Keller's Crossing and the valley, and had been sheltering at a neighboring farm for days before the smoke on the hillside had indicated there might be something better available. He had followed the tracks up. His voice was easy practiced, the kind of voice that had been useful to him in commercial contexts, and he deployed it in the underground chamber with the same confidence he might have used across a store counter. He asked who had found the place. He asked how much food was stored. He asked with the kind of casually phrased question that was not casual whether anyone knew whose property it was. Clara told him what she knew: the shelter belonged to Silas Dunmore, who had built it and died 2 years ago. She did not elaborate further. Amos Leach was quiet for a moment. Then, with the timing of something rehearsed, "Silas Dunmore was my uncle." The room shifted in the way rooms shifted when something changed the arrangement of power within them. Ruth looked at him. Agnes looked at Clara. Garrett, who had returned from some task in the storage alcove, stopped in the doorway. Amos reached into the coat's inside pocket and produced a folded paper. He unfolded it on the nearest shelf surface and smoothed it with his palm and stepped back slightly so others could see. It appeared to be a deed or bill of transfer, handwritten, bearing what looked like a county seal at the top. The name Dunmore appeared in it. The name Leach appeared in it. Ruth moved to examine it. Clara had learned the kind of person who moved toward information rather than away from it. She looked at the document for a moment. Her voice carried a note Clara had not heard from her before, not conviction, but the particular sound of someone who wants something to be true because it makes other things simpler. If this land is yours, you have a right to say how it's managed. Clara felt the room repositioning itself around this statement. It was not that anyone wanted her removed. It was that the offer of a clear authority was attractive in the specific way that clear authority was always attractive to people who were tired and cold and had been living in ambiguity. A rightful owner was a simple thing. A 17-year-old girl who had found a door in a hillside was a complicated thing. She looked at Amos Leach, and he met her eyes, and she understood with the instinctive reading of a person who had spent 6 years in a household where power was exercised by someone who did not particularly care about her welfare, that she was looking at someone who was managing the room rather than responding to it. She did not speak yet. The ledger was on the shelf 2 feet from where Amos had laid his document. She looked at it and then looked back at him and said nothing, and she began in the back of her mind to search through everything she had read across 2 days of careful study, looking for the specific entries she remembered, but had not understood at the time as something she might need. She would find it. She already knew she would find it, but finding it correctly and using it at the moment when it would matter, rather than the moment when it would only prove she was right, were different skills, and she had the night ahead of her to practice the difference. Outside, the storm maintained itself above the hill with the patient indifference of weather that had not consulted anyone's timeline. Inside, 9 people and 1 newcomer shared the warmth of a dead man's preparation, and the question of who had the right to decide how that warmth was distributed had just become complicated in a way that would require more than a document to resolve. Clara kept her face still and her breathing even and fed the stove the next piece of wood. That night, Clara did not sleep. She kept the stove at its minimum functional level, added a piece of wood every 90 minutes with the regularity of someone who had converted necessity into discipline, and in the intervals between, she sat on the floor with the ledger open across her knees and read every entry she had not yet read with full attention. Amos Leach had taken the bunk nearest the stove. He had done this without asking and without the particular social hesitation that people demonstrated when they were uncertain of their standing. He had arranged himself in the space with the settled confidence of someone who had already decided that the space was his, and he had gone to sleep while the rest of the room was still adjusting to a presence, which was its own kind of statement. His document lay refolded in his coat's inside pocket. He had not left it out for further examination, which Clara noted. Documents that were genuinely secure tended to stay visible. Documents that were instruments tended to disappear once they had done their work. She read by firelight, moving through the ledger's middle pages that she had covered quickly in her first reading and had not returned to looking for the specific passage she remembered but could not locate precisely. The practical entries continued season by season, the record of a man's careful attention to the conditions of his survival. Temperature observations, notes on the moisture behavior of the earth walls at different points in the winter, an account of a roof repair on the storage alcove after a section of the earth cap had subsided following a wet autumn. The voice of the entries was even unhurried, the voice of someone who wrote for accuracy rather than for an audience. Then on page 31, the passage she had read and moved past and now needed. It was a single paragraph written in the same careful hand as everything surrounding it. Silas had been reflecting on the winter of his wife's death 14 years before the final entry, and the paragraph concerned the question of inheritance, not in a legal sense, but in a practical one. The question of what happened to a prepared place when the person who had prepared it was no longer present to maintain it. He had written, "My brother Caleb's family is in Ohio, and I have not spoken to Caleb in 11 years and have no interest in renewing the acquaintance. He made certain choices I cannot respect, and I have no children remaining to inherit anything I might leave. When I am gone, this shelter goes to the hill which was always more its owner than I was. She read it twice. Then she read the sentence before it, I have no family in this county or the adjacent ones and no intention of acquiring any. No family in this county or the adjacent ones. A brother in Ohio, 11 years of silence, no interest in renewing the acquaintance. Amos Leach had presented himself as Silas's nephew. A nephew required a sibling who had produced children. The sibling existed Caleb, Ohio, 11 years of estrangement. What the ledger made clear in Silas's characteristically precise language was that the estrangement was not casual or circumstantial, but principled in that Silas had no knowledge of or contact with anyone from that branch of whatever family had once connected them. This did not prove that Amos was lying. A nephew could exist without Silas knowing him, but it produced a specific problem with Amos's account. A man who wrote with Silas's precision would have noted a nephew if a nephew had ever visited or corresponded, because Silas noted everything that was relevant to his understanding of his circumstances. The absence of any mention of a nephew combined with the explicit statement about having no family in the county or adjacent ones combined with the 11-year estrangement from the only sibling named, the combination produced a gap between what Amos claimed and what the evidence supported that was too wide to cross without more than a document. She also thought about the document itself. The county seal had looked right at a distance. It had looked less right when she had examined it briefly before Amos refolded it. The seal's impression had the right shape, but the ink distribution had the particular quality of something stamped onto paper that had been dampened first, which produced sharper edges than dry paper, but also a slightly different sheen in the impression's relief. She was not a clerk. She was not certain. But she had spent 6 years watching Earl Sutter manage his farm's paperwork with the casual inattention of a man who found it tedious. And in doing so, she had handled enough actual county documents to have an impression of what they looked like that was more than superficial. She closed the ledger. She put it in her lap and sat with her hands flat on its cover and thought about timing. The information she had was useful only at the right moment. Presenting it immediately in the middle of the night would wake people from sleep and require them to process a conflict before they had the reserves to process it well. Presenting it in the morning when everyone was present and alert and had eaten their morning portion and had the ordinary daily clarity that food produced was a different kind of moment. She waited. Amos woke early. She watched him come alert without the gradual surfacing that most people showed. He went from still to observant in a single transition, the wakefulness of someone who had spent considerable time in unfamiliar situations. He looked at the room in one sweep before doing anything else, and when his eyes reached Clara sitting on the floor with the ledger he held on her a fraction of a second longer than the sweep required, he began redistributing the morning's food portion before Ruth had picked up the ladle. He did it smoothly with the confident ease of someone exercising a right that had already been established rather than a right that was still under discussion. He gave himself a larger portion than he gave anyone else, not dramatically. Larger, carefully larger, calibrated to be noticed only by someone watching for it. He gave Ruth a portion slightly larger than Clara's, the action of someone who understood that secondary authorities were most useful when they believed their interests were being attended to. Ruth accepted her portion without comment. Agnes looked at hers and looked at Clara without speaking. Garrett took what he was given with the expression of a man who was watching something he had not yet fully named. Clara stood up. She carried the ledger to the shelf where Amos had rested his document the previous evening, and she set it down flat and opened it to page 31 and stepped back. She kept her voice even in the particular way of someone who had decided that the information was the argument and that adding emotion to it was subtraction rather than addition. There's a passage in here that's relevant to what you told us last night. The room came to attention in the way rooms did when the quality of a voice indicated that something was being resolved rather than discussed. Amos looked at the open ledger with an expression that did not change as rapidly as it should have. A person encountering unexpected documentary evidence typically showed surprise or interest or the specific anxiety of someone whose claim was being tested. What Amos showed very briefly was the stillness of someone who had encountered an obstacle they were calculating how to move around. Garrett crossed to the ledger and read the passage. He read it twice the way Clara had, and then he read the sentence before it, and then he stood back and looked at Amos with an expression that was quieter and more serious than anger. Amos's response came with the practiced ease of a man who had prepared contingencies. Silas and my father hadn't spoken in years. It doesn't surprise me that he didn't write about our side of the family. People write about what's in front of them, not about what they've closed off. It was not a bad answer. It contained enough truth to be difficult to dismiss outright. Ruth was looking at the document Amos had now produced again, from his coat pocket, smooth on the shelf surface as it had been the previous evening. She was looking at it with the closer attention that daylight and a specific concern made possible. Her finger traced the seal's impression without touching it. The particular stubbornness of Ruth Calder, which Clara had observed for days, now the stubbornness of a woman who had built and maintained her own household for years and had never done it by being wrong when being right mattered, was operating against the position she had taken the previous evening rather than in defense of it. Ruth's voice came out slower than usual. The date on this transfer is from 6 years ago. Silas's last entry was 2 years ago. If your uncle had signed property to you 6 years ago, why was he still writing about it as his own in these pages? The room held the question like a space that had been cleared for something to fall into. Amos had an answer for this too, but it arrived a half-second later than his previous answers, and that half-second was audible in the way that pauses were audible when they were filled with construction rather than recollection. He said that legal transfer and practical occupation were different things, that his uncle had continued using the land while the legal interest had passed, that this was common enough in family arrangements. Garrett's voice was careful in the way of a man who did not say unnecessary things. A family arrangement between a man and a nephew he apparently didn't know well enough to mention in 12 years of journals. Something in Amos's performance shifted, then not collapsed, but recalibrated. The ease that he had maintained since arriving began showing its structure, the effort underneath it becoming briefly visible. He was not a man who lost his composure in the way of people who had never had much practice maintaining it. He was a man whose composure was a tool, and the tool was being applied harder than it had been designed for. He looked around the room at faces that were no longer arranged in his favor. Agnes had moved closer to Elliot. Nettie was watching from her position against the rear wall with the full attention she had been directing at the room since the previous night's crisis. Ruth's posture had shifted in the way that bodies shifted when they were withdrawing from a position they had taken. What Amos did then was not what Clara had expected. He did not push harder. He sat down on the bunk he had claimed, and he put his elbows on his knees, and he said in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used since arriving, "I need to stay until the road is passable. That's the truth of it. I need to stay, and I needed a reason that would hold." The room absorbed this. It was a different kind of statement than anything that had preceded it, carrying the specific weight of something that had been stripped of its prepared surface and was showing the actual material beneath. She said what the situation made straightforwardly true. Nobody is being put out in this weather. That was never the question. Amos looked at her. His expression had the particular quality of someone who was being told something that was worse and better than what they had expected. Simultaneously worse because it meant the manipulation had been unnecessary, better because the alternative to manipulation had been available all along. The document went back into his pocket. He did not produce it again. For the remaining days of the storm, Amos occupied the shelter with the specific quietness of someone who had been relieved of a performance and did not know how to fill the space the performance had occupied. He was useful as it turned out. He had a practical competence that expressed itself in small repairs. A crossbar on the storage alcove's door frame that had been loose since before Clara's arrival, and that he fixed with 3 nails from the hardware tin, and the efficiency of someone who had done similar work before. He split wood when the supply on the main stack dropped below a threshold. Clara had established doing this without being asked, which was a more meaningful apology than anything that could have been put into words in that particular company. Ruth said nothing to him that was warm and nothing that was hostile, which was Ruth's version of a verdict. He accepted it. The storm broke on the 13th day. Clara knew it before opening the door because the stove's draw changed the gusts that had been creating pressure variations across the pipe for almost 2 weeks, smoothed into a steady pull. The kind of pull that meant the wind above had organized itself into a consistent direction rather than the chaotic, multi-directional assault of a storm system. The sound through the earth changed too, from something that pressed and released to something that moved continuously in a single direction. And continuous movement was always better than the trapped, cycling energy of weather that couldn't decide where it was going. She climbed the stairs alone and opened the door, and the world outside was white and still and bright in a way that required her eyes several seconds to adjust to after 13 days of firelight and lantern glow. The sky above the ridgeline was the particular blue of winter clarity, the kind of blue that appeared only after weather had thoroughly cleaned the air, and the sunlight on the snow was not warm, but it was present, which was categorically different from its absence. The valley below was altered in the way that serious weather always altered landscapes, not destroyed, but rearranged the familiar shapes of farms and fence lines and roads, simplified by snow into something that would require relearning. She could see the Briggs farm from the hill's face, its roof bearing a weight of accumulated snow that would need to come down carefully, and the Hollis property further into the valley with its woodpile exposed on the south side, where the wind had swept it partially clear. The road was not visible as a road, but was inferable as a line of slightly different texture running east toward where Keller's Crossing sat behind its own low ridge. People would be moving soon. People would be assessing, digging out, discovering the full accounting of what the storm had cost them. Over the following days, as the valley began its cautious return to function, that accounting became clear in increments. 3 storage sheds had collapsed under snow load. 2 families had burned through their wood supplies before the storm ended and had survived the final days by burning furniture, which worked, but at a cost they were still calculating. The road to Keller's Crossing was technically passable by the 3rd day after the break, meaning a man on foot who was willing to work hard could get through, but not a wagon and not easily. Food stocks across the valley were substantially lower than anyone's pre-storm estimate had suggested they should be, because pre-storm estimates had been built on the assumption that weather would behave within the range of previous experience, and this storm had not. The shelter had not been untouched by the duration. Clara's careful rationing had maintained functionality, but not comfort. Portions had been small for the last 5 days, enough to prevent the kind of depletion that produced dangerous decisions, but not enough to feel adequate. The wood supply had been reduced to 7 pieces when the storm broke, which was not the margin she had planned for, but was a margin nonetheless. The water barrels were both below half. What remained on the shelves represented the residue of the shelter's generosity. Rather than a reserve, it had given what it had been designed to give, and the 2/3 that remained was the measure of Silas's original calculation. The valley people climbed to the shelter in the days after the break. Some came to return, borrowed warmth with tangible exchange. A family brought a quarter quart of split oak they had managed to keep dry in their house's back room, which Ruth accepted and stacked with the precision that was Ruth's default mode of engaging with physical tasks. Another brought grain. Another brought a large sealed tin of lard that Clara identified as more valuable than its weight suggested, because lard maintained calories without requiring cooking and was the kind of food that remained useful across a wider range of emergency conditions than most alternatives. They also came to look. This was the visit beneath the practical visit, the thing people needed that they could not directly request, the understanding of how the shelter had done, what it had done, how the underground space had maintained its conditions while the surface world was being overwhelmed. Clara showed it without theater walking people through the main chamber in the storage alcove and explaining the arch's structural logic and the pipe's angle and the reason the earth walls managed moisture the way they did. She used Silas's language where she had it, and her own where she didn't, and she gave credit to the man whose preparation she was describing with the explicitness of someone who believed that credit was not diminished by being accurately assigned. His name was said in the valley more in those 2 weeks than it had ever been said while he was living in the hills. People who had known him vaguely as an eccentric, who had retreated from valley life after the epidemic that had taken his family, began reconstructing him through what the shelter revealed about his thinking. The man they reconstructed was more substantial than the man they had ignored. This was frequently how it worked. The living were always somewhat flattened by proximity. The dead allowed their full dimension only after the pressure of their presence was removed. Garrett Hollis became the shelter's most consistent external supporter in the weeks following the storm. He brought tools and labor without being asked, reinforcing the entrance frame, where the repeated heavy use of the storm weeks had begun to loosen the timber fittings, installing a proper wooden step where the stone stairs had worn smooth and become a hazard. He did not do this to settle anything between them. He did it the way Clara had come to recognize that practical people settled accounts through work on the thing that needed work without converting the work into a statement about themselves. Nettie came with him every time. She was, Clara slowly understood, not the same person she had been on the first day. The change was not dramatic. She did not emerge from her previous stillness into some opposite of it. But she was present in the shelter in a different way, engaged rather than endured. And the particular attention she had been directing at Clara since the second chimney crisis had deepened into something that was difficult to name without overcomplicating it. She watched how Clara made decisions. She watched how Clara spoke to Ruth, which was directly and without softening, and how Clara spoke to Elliot, which was also directly but differently calibrated, and how Clara spoke to Garrett, which was like speaking to an equal in a situation where equals did not always exist. On the fourth day after the storm broke, Nettie sat beside Clara while she was updating the ledger and asked what she was writing. Clara told her the remaining supply counts the temperature estimates for the last 3 days, a note about which jars had proven reliable over the course of the winter and which had not. The same kind of record Silas had kept continued in the same pages by a different hand. Nettie's voice was thoughtful in the specific way of young people who thought before they spoke. "You're writing for whoever comes next." Clara put the pencil down and considered the sentence. It was more precisely articulate than anything she had said to herself about why she was doing it, which was sometimes how other people's observations worked, arriving at the thing you knew, but had not located language for. The news about Amos Leach reached the valley in the 3rd week after the storm, carried by a man from Keller's Crossing who had come up the road to check on the outlying properties. Amos had been known in the town. He was known, the man reported, as a person with a history of arriving in difficult situations with paperwork that benefited him and a story that sounded better than it was. He had been detained the previous autumn on a complaint from a family in the county south of theirs, something involving a property claim, during a period of flooding when the family had been displaced and vulnerable, and Amos had appeared with a document in a sympathetic manner. The complaint had not been fully resolved before the storm, and his absence during the storm weeks had been noted by the county sheriff's office in Keller's Crossing. Agnes heard this and looked at Clara with an expression that contained several things that did not need to be spoken. Ruth heard it and was quiet in the specific way that Ruth was quiet when she was processing information that required her to update a previous position. She did not say anything that acknowledged her earlier alignment with Amos's claim. She simply moved forward from the moment with the focused practicality that was her primary mode of engaging with the world. Clara found this acceptable. The standard she held for Ruth was not confession, but conduct, and Ruth's conduct in the weeks following the storm had been unambiguous. The man from Keller's Crossing also brought word that the county was aware of the shelter's existence. A land office inquiry had been opened about the property's status, given that its owner of record had died without registered heirs and without a will filed in the county. The inquiry would take time. The outcome was uncertain. Clara listened to this and noted it and filed it without the anxiety it might have produced in her 2 months ago. What the land office decided about the shelter's legal status was a real concern and would require attention when it became a concrete problem rather than a pending one. What the shelter was in the material sense, what it had done, what it had been, what it continued to be, was not subject to any inquiry. Amos had asked with his paperwork who owned the place. The question had been the wrong question all along, or had been the right question asked in service of the wrong purpose. The relevant question was not who owned it, but what it was for, and what it was for had been established by its builder and demonstrated by its use, and was not contained in any document that could be filed or presented or refolded and put in a coat pocket. The relationship between Clara and Ruth had settled by the end of the third week into something that would have been unrecognizable compared to their first exchange. It was not warmth. Warmth was not the currency either of them traded in naturally, and manufacturing it would have produced something both of them would have found insulting. What it was instead was the specific respect of two people who had identified in each other a shared approach to the material world, and understanding that things needed to be understood correctly before they could be managed well, and that managing them well was more important than managing them comfortably. Ruth came to the shelter 3 mornings a week and did inventory with Clara, and they worked through the counts together, and when they disagreed about a number, one of them recounted and reported back to the other without either of them making the disagreement into something larger than a disagreement about a number. It was, Clara thought, the closest thing to a working relationship she had experienced since her father had been alive to demonstrate what one looked like. The morning of the fourth week after the storm broke, Clara was splitting wood outside the shelter's entrance when she heard footsteps on the path. The path was real now, beaten into the hillside surface by weeks of traffic wide enough for two people side by side with a branch laid across the muddiest section near the bottom as a crossing. She heard the footsteps before she saw the person, and she continued splitting through the recognition of the footstep pattern because she knew the weight and gait behind them and had been waiting for this particular arrival since the storm ended, knowing it would come eventually, because the logic of the situation made it inevitable, and because the man in question had nowhere else that was likely to have him. Earl Sutter was thinner. Not dramatically, she would have noticed dramatic immediately and set it aside as information, but the particular thinness of a man who had been eating less than his baseline for an extended period, the face slightly hollowed along the jaw, the coat hanging differently at the shoulders. He had not shaved in what looked like 10 days. He stopped on the path when she looked up from the splitting, and the two of them were at the distance of approximately 20 feet, which was too far for nuance and too close for avoidance. He did not come closer. He held at 20 feet, and his eyes went from her face to the shelter's entrance and back to her face, and he said the only thing the situation allowed him to say without it being something worse. The farmhouse roof, the main beam came down 2 weeks ago. I've been at the Briggs place, but they can't manage much more. Clara set the axe down with its head in the dirt and its handle upright. She looked at him for a moment that was not long, but contained more than duration could account for. She was standing in the position he had occupied on the farmhouse porch inside, looking out the doorway at her back, the cold between them. She was aware of this. She suspected he was aware of it too, and that his awareness of it was part of why he was standing at 20 feet rather than the full distance he could have maintained. She had thought in occasional moments over the past weeks about what she would do when this happened. She had not thought about it obsessively because obsessive anticipation of difficult moments was a way of suffering them twice, and she was not a person who chose to suffer twice what she could suffer once. But she had thought about it enough to have arrived at something that was not a decision exactly, but was the shape a decision would take when the moment required it. She bent and picked up the next piece of wood from the pile and set it on the block and split it with a single clean stroke. Then she set the axe handle against the shelter's door frame and stepped to the side of the entrance and looked at him. She said nothing. The door stood open behind her. Earl Sutter walked the 20 feet slowly and went past her and down the stairs, and she followed him without speaking. And when he reached the bottom of the stairs and the warmth of the main chamber enclosed him that same involuntary stillness, the body requiring its moment to believe the warmth was real, she went past him to the shelf and took down a tin cup and poured water from the small pot that sat warming at the stove's side and placed it on the shelf at the height he would reach it naturally. Then she went back to the wood. Ruth was inside when Earl arrived doing her morning count. She emerged from the storage alcove and saw Earl standing with the cup and saw Clara's absence and understood the arrangement without requiring explanation, which was one of the things Clara had come to appreciate about Ruth. She could read the shape of a situation without needing it narrated to her. Earl sat in the corner nearest the stairs for the rest of that day and said almost nothing. The people who came and went from the shelter during those hours were people who knew who he was and what he had done, and they managed this knowledge with the specific grace of people who understood that the shelter was not a place where old scores were settled, but a place where the winter's terms were met, and the winter's terms did not include the luxury of comfortable hatred. That night, Clara put a folded blanket on the floor at the end of the bunk and put a bowl of the evening's food beside it, and she set these things down without comment and without looking at him, and she went to the stove to manage the nightly banking. Earl sat where he had been sitting and looked at the blanket in the bowl for a long moment. In the morning, he was up before she was. She heard the sound of the axe outside and lay in the bunk for a moment, parsing the rhythm of the strokes, which were steady and experienced. And she understood what the sound meant in the way that certain actions meant more than their physical content when they were performed in the context of what had come before. She got up and began the morning inventory and did not go outside until there was enough wood by the door that carrying it down was the next practical task. March arrived without ceremony, the way seasons arrived in the Allegheny Ridges, not with a single dramatic change, but with an accumulation of small ones, each insufficient to be called thaw, but collectively constituting a direction. The angle of the light shifted, the quality of the cold became different, less absolute, retaining somewhere in it the suggestion of what the air had been before December had settled in. Snowmelt began on the south-facing slopes in the afternoons and refroze at night, and the ice made the paths treacherous in the early mornings until the sun came up enough to soften it. The valley began the long project of accounting for itself. Families assessed their losses, the collapsed sheds, the depleted stores, the animals that had not come through the fencing that would need replacement before spring planting could proceed. The accounting was painful in the way that honesty about costly mistakes was always painful, but the valley was not broken, and the difference between damaged and broken was not small. Clara stood outside the shelter one morning in the third week of March and looked down at the valley in the clear early light and counted 3 properties where work had already begun on side hill storage rooms, structures that used the hillside's mass as their primary insulating element that went into the earth rather than sitting on top of it. She had not suggested this to anyone directly. She had shown people the shelter and explained what made it work and left the conclusions to them, which was the only way to reach conclusions that stuck. She spent several days of the thaw climbing the hill above the shelter, exploring the terrain above the point she had been managing during the storm. The hill was different in partial thaw than it had been under full snow cover, the micro-topography re-emerging the specific shapes of rocks and roots and ground variations, becoming readable again after months of erasure. She was becoming familiar with the land above the shelter the way she had become familiar with the land of the Sutter farm over 6 years by walking it repeatedly and paying attention. She found Silas on a Thursday. She was not immediately certain what she was seeing. The soil had been disturbed by the freeze-thaw cycling near the hill's upper face, heaved and partially washed in the snowmelt, and the dark shape she saw, half exposed in the mud, was first processed as a root as a stone, as the usual debris of a hillside uncovering itself after winter. Then the shape resolved, the angle of it, the specific way bone presented itself when it had been in the ground long enough to have lost what was not bone, but not so long that the bone itself had fully broken down. There was not much. 2 winters of being in the earth had taken the soft materials and left what was hard. A section of rib, the articulation of a hand partly intact, which was how she identified it as human rather than animal. Beside the hand, partially buried still, the split and blackened wood of a walking stick, broken at the point where it had been used beyond the material's tolerance. And above the whole arrangement, the iron collar of the stovepipe, emerging from the earth exactly where she had cleared it in the storm, the location she had fixed in her mind in the dark, in the wind, and reached by memory. He had been within 10 feet of the pipe collar when he stopped, 10 feet from a marker that would have told him exactly where the door was below, and to the right 30 feet down the hill's face. If the snow had been less deep, or if the light had been different, or if his leg had allowed him another few minutes of searching. 10 feet was a distance that could be crossed in seconds under ordinary conditions, and was an unbridgeable distance under the conditions he had been in, which were conditions she understood in her body now in ways she had not understood them before this winter. She sat on the wet ground near what remained of Silas Dunmore, and she did not cry, and she did not pray, because she was not certain what she believed about the utility of either, and in the absence of certainty, she tended towards silence. She sat for a long time in the thin March sunlight, with the valley opening up below her, and the shelter entrance, somewhere below her feet, and the remains of the man who had built it, arranged in the earth beside her. He had prepared for everything he could reach with preparation. What had ended him was the gap between what preparation could cover and what it could not, the specific injury, the specific timing, the specific depth of the specific storm. He had been walking back from doing the exact practical thing the shelter required, and the shelter had been here, and he had not been able to cross the remaining distance, and there was no frame of understanding that made that clean. It was simply what had happened. The world did not arrange itself around preparation, however careful. It only sometimes rewarded it, and sometimes rewarded it by allowing someone else to benefit from it instead. She put her hand briefly on the earth above the hand's articulation, which was the closest she could come to the gesture the moment seemed to warrant, and then she stood up and began the descent. She told Garrett first because he was practical and would know what was needed, and then she told Ruth because Ruth's competence extended into the organizational demands of communal obligation, and between them, they arranged what needed to be arranged. 6 people climbed the hill 2 days later when the ground had dried enough to make the climb reasonable, carrying the implements that the task required. The work was conducted with the spare efficiency that serious tasks sometimes arrived at when the people performing them understood both what they were doing and why. They buried him at the top of the hill, not at the spot where she had found him higher above it, the highest point of the hill's crest, where the view opened in 3 directions and the valley below was fully visible. In a way, it was not from anywhere else on the slope. Garrett cut and fitted a cross from ashwood, the grain tight, and even the joints doweled rather than nailed, because doweled joints were stronger and Silas Dunmore had built for strength. Clara carved the inscription herself using the small chisel from the tool crate, working slowly to get the letters even. The inscription was simple because simplicity was what the situation deserved. His name. The year she could estimate from the ledger's earliest and latest dates. And below those 4 words that were not her words, but had become hers through the winter he built for winter. Nobody spoke at length. There was nothing to say that the cross did not say, and the hill did not say, and the shelter 30 feet below the crest did not say in its own persistent, practical, ongoing language. They stood in the March sunlight for several minutes. 6 people who had survived a winter they might not have survived on the hill of a man they had known only through the evidence of his thinking, and the valley below them showed its first serious signs of life, smoke from multiple chimneys, the movement of figures between structures, the beginning of the work that would have to be done before the season turned. Clara walked back down alone after the others had descended. She stopped at the shelter's entrance and put her hand on the doorframe, the old wood cold and dry under her palm, the iron of the latch at the edge of her thumb. The entrance was different now than it had been on the night she had found it. There was a proper step. Garrett's work in the frame had been reinforced, and the drift clearance space around the door had been improved with a shallow trench that directed meltwater away. The shelter was being maintained by more hands than one, which was what it had always been built for, even if Silas had built it alone. The knife was in her coat pocket. The ledger was on the shelf inside. The stove had been banked that morning and would hold coals until the afternoon. She went back to work.